Reformed Thinking presents The Deep Dive. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another deep dive into fascinating subjects. Today, we're taking on a truly significant topic, the divine name, commonly known as YHWH. This deep dive is designed to give you a clear, well-informed understanding of this central name in the Hebrew Bible. We'll look at its origins, its sound, and how it has been understood and treated throughout history.
Absolutely. We'll try to unpack the layers of scholarship and historical practice surrounding this name. Our goal here is really to extract the essential insights and maybe some surprising facts from a whole stack of sources, academic research, linguistic analyses, ancient texts, you name it. We're focusing on what scholars have generally concluded about this name, helping you grasp not just what it is, but maybe why its study is relevant for understanding the Bible and the faith it conveys.
Okay, great. Let's start at the most fundamental level then. How was this name originally pronounced? I think for many of us, Jehovah has been the familiar sound for generations, right? So it was quite a revelation to learn that scholars actually point to a different original pronunciation. What does the evidence tell us?
Yeah, that's a really common understanding and maybe a misconception. There's a good reason for it, which I think we'll get into later. But the consensus among scholars, it's pretty clear, actually. The original pronunciation of those four Hebrew consonants, what we call the Tetragrammaton, is widely concluded to be Yahweh. And this isn't just, a guess or some modern invention. It's supported by several lines of strong evidence that really point in the same direction.
Okay, Yahweh. What kind of evidence are we talking about? What backs that up?
Well, for one thing, the sound Yahweh seems to be suggested by a clever play on words right there in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. You know that foundational passage where God identifies himself to Moses? He uses the Hebrew phrase, hayaso. It's often translated, I am that I am, or maybe I will be what I will be. The key part here is the verb ehaya, I shall be.
Right, I shall be.
Exactly. And the name Yahweh, just in its structure, seems to echo and derive from that very verb. It suggests as meaning like he who causes to be, or maybe he who shows himself to be active. So this subtle linguistic link within the text itself strongly points towards Yahweh as the intended sound. It gives this dynamic picture of God's self-revelation, his active presence.
Huh. So the Bible itself gives us a clue through wordplay. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Are there other linguistic clues maybe outside the biblical text itself?
Oh, absolutely. Beyond the biblical text, we find some crucial support from ancient Greek transcriptions. Think about it. When early writers and translators encountered this Hebrew name, they had to try and write it down using Greek letters. That gives us kind of a phonetic snapshot from back then. For instance, you have Clement of Alexandria, an early church father, writing in his work Stramata around the late 2nd century CE. He transcribed the name in Greek as Iaouai or Iaouai.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And then other early church fathers like Theodoret and Epiphanius, writing a bit later, maybe 3rd and 4th century CE, they attested to the pronunciation Iabe, which you'd pronounce Yahweh. And they specifically noted this was how the Samaritans pronounced it. So that gives us an additional witness from a different, though related, cultural context.
Yeah, Beba. So similar sounds again.
Very similar. And it's not just Christian writers either. Other similar Greek forms like IAO are found in sources such as Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek historian from the 1st century BCE. You also find it in other ancient Greek writers like Macrobius and Hesychius. Clement of Alexandria also mentions IAOU. So these various transcriptions, coming from different ancient contexts, spanning several centuries and different literary traditions, they consistently lean toward that Yahweh kind of vocalization. They act like little ancient audio recordings guiding us toward the original sound.
That's pretty strong confirmation from external sources. What about within the Hebrew language itself? Like in other names or maybe phrases, does that offer any insight?
It certainly does, yeah. The very existence and the forms of contracted elements of the divine name within Hebrew proper names and poetry also seem to favor Yahweh. Consider the contracted form Yah. This shorter version of Roder appears 50 times in the Old Testament. It shows up early in powerful poems like in Exodus 15.2, where it declares, "My strength and song is Yah."
Right. Yeah.
You also find it in poetic extracts, like Exodus 17.1 scene, mentioning the hand to the throne of Yah, and in Isaiah 38.11, it's especially frequent in the later Psalms, particularly in the Hallel Psalms, and it's a key part of that familiar phrase, hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Yeah.
Which literally means praise Yah. And that phrase itself appears 24 times. The continued usage of this shorter form, especially in liturgy and poetry, it reinforces the underlying Yahweh pronunciation. I mean, if Jehovah were the root, you might expect something like Jehovah-Jah or similar, which, we just don't see.
That makes sense.
And furthermore, you have forms like yahu and YHWH and reloshi. These are found as final or initial elements in many theophoric names.
Theophoric, meaning names that contain a divine element, right? Like a part of God's name.
Exactly. Names that carry God's name within them. We see this in lots of familiar biblical names. Jehonathan, Jehohanan, Jehoiakim, Jehoshaphat, even Joshua. These aren't just linguistic quirks. They show how deeply woven God's name was into the very fabric of ancient Israelite identity and expression. When Yahweh is a final element in names, it can change slightly to Yah, like in a name like Array or Yahu, which becomes Array, and as a prefix, Yeho or Yo are common, sometimes slightly altered to you. The prefix is thought to be the oldest and also the latest form in compound names, with Harel being sort of an intermediate form from the earlier post-exilic period up until the time of Chronicles.
Wow. So these internal structural changes within Hebrew names themselves also point strongly to Yahweh. That seems like a really solid case. But okay, if Yahweh is the original sound, what does this tell us about Jehovah and where did that pronunciation come from? It's just so widely known.
It is indeed, and this raises a really key point. Jehovah is, yes, a very common pronunciation, but historically speaking, it's incorrect. The pronunciation Jehovah, well, it's considered incorrect because it basically arose from mixing the consonants of lelo with the vowels of a different Hebrew word, Adonai, which means Lord. This mixing happened much later, really in the Middle Ages.
Mixing consonants and vowels from different words, why would they do that? That seems odd.
It does seem odd from our perspective, but there was a very specific reverential reason behind it. This takes us back centuries before the Middle Ages. See, since at least the 1st century AD, the name itself was considered too sacred, too holy to pronounce out loud. And this tradition referred to it as a nomen ineffabile, basically, an unutterable name.
Unutterable.
Yeah. This deep reverence probably stemmed from a very strict interpretation of laws like Exodus 20.7, "You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain," or maybe Leviticus 24.11, which talks about blasphemy against the name. For them, pronouncing the name in everyday life might risk taking it in vain or somehow diminishing its unique sanctity. It was about profound respect.
Okay, so out of respect, they avoided saying it.
Exactly. And this deep respect led to the divine name being referred to simply as the name in Hebrew, Hashem. The Samaritans had a similar practice, calling it Shema. Now, to prevent readers from accidentally pronouncing the sacred name when reading the Hebrew scriptures aloud, the Masoretes.
Those were the Jewish scribes who preserved the Hebrew text, right?
Yeah.
The vowel markings and all that.
Precisely. They were active from roughly the 6th to 10th century CE. They instituted this clever practice. They would place the vowels of the noun Adonai, Lord, or sometimes if Adonai already appeared right next to Yahweh in the text, they'd use the vowels of Elohim, God. They'd place those vowels under the consonants of Elohim.
Ah, I see. So the consonants YHWH are there, but the vowels underneath are actually telling you to say Adonai or Elohim instead.
You got it. This textual convention is known as quaer perpetuum, which kind of means perpetual reading, or what is to be read. It was a signal, a reminder to the reader. Read the substitute word, Adonai or Elohim. Don't pronounce the actual name. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate reverential safeguard built right into the text. And this custom was already well established by the time the Septuagint translators did their work, way back starting in the 3rd century BCE. They consistently rendered as Hotelios, Kyrios, meaning the Lord, in their Greek translation.
So that substitution practice goes way back.
Way back. And that historical evolution is why Jehovah emerges much later. Someone, likely in the medieval period, didn't understand this quaer perpetuum convention. They saw the consonants YHWH and the vowels of Adonai written together, and they mistakenly mashed them together phonetically, creating the hybrid form Yahweh, or Jehovah. The first known written reference to Jehovah seems to be around 1381 in the writings of a Spanish Dominican friar named Raymundus Martini. It became more generally used around 1500 AD, and it was formally introduced into scholarship in 1520 by Galatinus, who was a confessor to Pope Leo X.
Wow, but even then, people contested it.
Oh yes, almost immediately. Scholars like Lemercier, J. Drusius, and L. Capellus argued against its grammatical and historical propriety right from the start. They recognized it was based on a misunderstanding of the Masoretic system. So while Jehovah became popular, especially in some translation traditions, its inaccuracy was noted by scholars very early on.
Okay, that clears up the whole Jehovah Yahweh question quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating piece of textual history. So we've covered how it likely sounded Yahweh and how Jehovah came about. Now, beyond the sound, what does the name Yahweh actually mean? What does it tell us about God himself?
Right, the meaning, the etymology, this is another fascinating area, and like a lot of ancient linguistics, there's always some scholarly discussion, some debate. But there's a widely held and I think very compelling view among scholars. It connects the name directly to the Hebrew verb to be, or maybe to become. The root is hai. The prevailing view among many scholars is that Yahweh is derived from the basic stem, the qual form of this verb.
The verb to be.
Yes. But it's really vital to understand that this isn't about static existence, like just saying he exists. It's much more dynamic than that. It speaks to an active existence. It suggests God isn't merely some unchanging philosophical concept, but one who is actively engaged, revealing himself, acting in the world.
Active, like he does things.
Exactly. The proposed meanings that flow from this connection really illustrate this dynamism. It could mean the one who is, which points to his self-existence, the source of all being, that's part of it, but also things like the existing ever-living, pointing to his eternal nature, always present, or even the one ever coming into manifestation as the God of redemption. That highlights God's ongoing action in history to save and deliver his people. More dynamically, it's often interpreted as he who shows himself to be active, or he who brings to pass, like he's the performer of his promise.
He who brings to pass, I like that. It feels very covenantal, very much about God's faithfulness.
It really does. Think about that burning bush encounter in Exodus 3 again. God reveals himself to Moses not as some static, distant entity, but as the God who is about to act, to deliver his people from slavery in Egypt. The whole story of the Exodus, the plagues, parting the Red Sea, it's all about God showing himself active, fulfilling promises he made generations before to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His name isn't just a label, it's like a dynamic verb in action throughout history, a testament to his faithfulness and his power.
Yeah, that fits perfectly with Exodus 3.14, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. It's God defining himself by his ongoing active presence.
Precisely. That divine self-identification, is seen as the direct background. The nominal form, Yahweh, he who will be it or he causes to be, in the very next verse, Exodus 3.15, is like a compression of that meaning. It suggests God is eternal, yes, but also consistent, actively fulfilling his promises. The prophet Hosea, much later in Hosea 12.6, also seems to allude to this etymology, stating Yahweh is his memorial name, underscoring his consistent, active character throughout generations.
That paints a really powerful picture of an active, engaged, promise-keeping God. You mentioned there's some scholarly debate, though.
Yeah.
What were some of those other theories about the meaning, and why are they generally less accepted today?
Right. It's good to be aware of the other suggestions, even if they aren't the prevailing view. Some earlier theories, for example, tried to link Yahweh to Arabic roots. These suggestions proposed meanings like the blowing one, maybe referring to wind or breath, or even the lightning hurler, the one raging in the storm, the one raining, kind of storm god imagery. But these interpretations are viewed with, let's say, considerable reservation by most scholars now. They're often considered less fitting for the theological context of Sinai in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, which is where the Bible firmly roots the name's revelation.
Yeah, storm god doesn't quite fit the Exodus narrative.
Not as well, no. Other suggestions included deriving it from a different verb form, the Hitzpel form of a, that would give meanings like the one bringing into being, or life giver, maybe even creator. That sounds compelling theologically, but the problem is a causative Hicksel of this specific verb doesn't seem to actually be used anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, so the linguistic connection is a bit tenuous.
So the evidence for that verb form isn't there.
Pretty much. The qual form has also been proposed to mean he who causes to fall, maybe referring to rain or lightning again, or perhaps destroying foes. And then you get a few other less common derivations, interpreting it simply as a noun meaning being, or even as some kind of ecstatic call, almost like an exclamation. But really, the dynamic connection to be, as seen in Exodus 3.44, and how it portrays God as consistently active and present, that remains the most widely accepted and I think the most resonant interpretation among scholars today. It just fits the overall biblical narrative best.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have the sound, Yahweh, and the meaning, pointing to God's active being. Where does the name itself historically originate? Was it unique to Israel right from the start, or did it perhaps exist in other cultures before Moses?
That's the next big question, the historical inception. And what's really crucial to state up front here is that there is no clear, unambiguous proof of the name Yahweh being used outside of Israel before the time of Moses. There are a few intriguing little mentions here and there, but nothing definitive that scholars agree on.
Like what kind of mentions?
Well, for example, some Egyptian sources from around the 14th, 13th centuries BCE describe certain nomadic groups in the Sinai-Canaan area as shasu off from you. Now, Wila looks tantalizingly close to YHWH, right? And scholars note it as an interesting name formation. But the consensus is that it's insufficiently clear whether this name Yahweh, apparently attested in Egyptian, can really have anything to do with the Yahweh of the Old Testament. We just don't have enough context to make a definitive link. It could be a coincidental sound, or maybe a reference to a completely different local deity or place.
So suggestive but not conclusive proof of pre-Mosaic use.
Exactly. And other proposed connections have also largely been dismissed by modern scholarship. For instance, some old Babylonian names from much earlier contain an element Yahum, but that's generally excluded as a connection because Yahum just means my, like a possessive suffix, not a divine name. Similarly, there's an element Yahweh or Yahu found in some names from Mari, an ancient city dating back to the 18th century BCE. This might be related to the same root as Yahweh, but when you look at the actual names, like Yahweh, it probably means something like God is or God exists, not necessarily Yahweh is God.
Okay, subtle but important distinctions.
Very. And then there's the Ugaritic god Wub, who is identified in texts from Ugarit as a son of the chief god El. Some older scholarship tried to link this U with Yahweh, but current consensus strongly separates them. They have distinct theological roles and contexts in their respective pantheons. Even earlier scholars, like the famous Wilhelm Gesenius, initially proposed that maybe Yahweh was super ancient, maybe related to Roman Jovis or Jupiter, and perhaps picked up by the Hebrews from the Egyptians.
Wow, suggesting a pagan origin.
Yes, but Gesenius himself later thoroughly retracted that idea, and current sources strongly contest it. Instead, the emphasis in scholarship now, reflecting the biblical account, is that God himself revealed this as his own personal name to Israel. The Israelites didn't just borrow it from Egyptians or other pagan cultures. The use of names like Yao on much later Hellenistic Gnostic gems, from maybe the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, is seen as a later development where pagans were borrowing ideas from Jewish theology, not the other way around. It actually points to Yahweh's original distinctness.
So the evidence points strongly towards a distinct revelation to Israel, rather than borrowing from others. How does the Bible itself narrate the origin of this name? Do different parts of the Bible present it differently?
That's a crucial point. And yes, different textual traditions within the Old Testament offer slightly different perspectives on when the name became known, while still affirming its divine origin. Generally, Old Testament traditions, with one notable potential exception in Genesis 4.26, which says, people began to call upon the name of Yahweh back then, consistently associate the name Yahweh with Mount Sinai and with Moses, often specifically in Midianite territory. This is the foundational point of origin within the main narrative arc.
Sinai and Moses.
Right. For instance, in what scholars often identify as the Elohist source, or one of the hypothetical literary strands proposed by biblical critics.
Based on things like different divine names being used, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In the e-source, the name Yahweh is explicitly revealed to Moses at Horeb, which is another name for Sinai, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 12 to 15. Before this point in its narrative, the e-source typically uses the more general term Elohim for God. Similarly, the priestly source, or P, another distinct literary tradition identified by scholars, very carefully avoids using the name Yahweh until its explicit revelation to Moses in Exodus chapter 6, verse 3.
Exodus 6.
And the P source goes even further. It portrays El Shaddai, usually translated God Almighty, as the name by which God was known to the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This suggests a kind of chronological progression in God's revealed names, with Yahweh being revealed later. Now, contrast that with the Yahweh source, or J, which is often considered the oldest of these traditions. The J source uses the name Yahweh right from the very beginning of its narrative, starting in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. It seems to assume the name was known from the earliest times, maybe offering an explanation for it in Genesis 21.33.
So J uses it from the start. E and P have it revealed specifically to Moses. That's interesting.
It is. These differences in usage across these potential biblical sources likely reflect distinct theological perspectives on when and how God's unique personal name became known to his people, while still fundamentally affirming its ultimate divine origin and revelation at a key moment in Israel's history.
And you mentioned the connection to Sinai and Midianite territory. Does that suggest anything else about its origins?
Well, that consistent biblical association of the name's revelation to the Sinai region gives what scholars call substantial significance to the Midianite or Kenite hypothesis. This is the idea that maybe the Israelite tribes, or perhaps Moses himself through his Midianite father-in-law Jethro, first encountered Yahwism in some form among these groups who lived in that region. Now, this hypothesis can't be proven with certainty, of course, but it holds a degree of probability among many scholars because the biblical text itself consistently links the name's revelation to that specific geographical and cultural context around Moses' time there. It doesn't necessarily deny divine revelation, but considers a possible human or cultural channel through which the knowledge of the name might have been mediated or become more widely known to the Israelites.
Okay, so we have this name, Yahweh, revealed by God, likely to Moses at Sinai, with a specific meaning tied to God's active being. How often does it actually appear in the Bible? You said it's central. Just how central?
The prevalence of Shing in the Old Testament is truly striking. It is the proper name of the God of Israel. It appears with remarkable frequency. The most accurate counts based on detailed textual analysis put the number at 6,823 times. Some precise comparisons even result in a figure of 6,828 occurrences. You'll often see more general figures cited in scholarly sources like around 6,800 times or more than 6,700 times.
Wow, nearly 7,000 times. That's a lot.
That's enormous. To give you some perspective, that makes it by far the most dominant divine name in the Old Testament. It appears more often than all other divine titles like Elohim, Adonai, El Shaddai combined. The name is found in nearly every single book of the Old Testament. That shows just how central it was to Israelite faith and literature. It's like this constant drumbeat throughout the entire story of God and his people.
Found in nearly every book. That's incredible. But if it's almost everywhere, are there any books where it's intentionally not used or maybe appears very rarely? That would be just as telling as its presence, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And those absences or rarities are quite revealing, actually. They tell us something about the specific focus or context of those books. For instance, you will not find the name Yahweh at all in the book of Ecclesiastes. Not once.
Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities.
Right. That book is more of a philosophical reflection on the meaning of life under the sun, as it puts it. It often uses the more general term Elohim, God, which fits its kind of universal wisdom focus rather than focusing specifically on Israel's covenant relationship tied to the name Yahweh.
Huh.
Similarly, the name Yahweh is never found in the book of Esther.
Esther, really? But God's providence is so central to that story.
It is, but the name isn't explicitly mentioned. This is particularly interesting because many scholars point to Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai's famous line to Esther, "If you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place." That phrase, "from another place" or "from another quarter," is widely interpreted as a subtle, indirect, perhaps even reverent nod to God's providence without actually using the divine name. It's like the author is deliberately avoiding it, maybe showing reverence even in its absence, or perhaps reflecting the idea of God working behind the scenes, his hidden hand, in a narrative set entirely outside the Promised Land during a period of exile.
Huh. A hidden reference. That's fascinating. Any other books?
Yes, the name is also omitted entirely from the Song of Songs. Given its focus on human love and its poetic nature, the absence there also makes sense contextually. It's not primarily a theological treatise. In the book of Daniel, while it's not entirely absent, it is used very rarely. It appears only 7 times, all within chapter 9, which is Daniel's prayer, for a total of just 8 occurrences in the entire book. This might relate to Daniel's prophetic visions extending beyond Israel to Gentile kingdoms, or its focus on God's universal sovereignty, where perhaps a more general divine title like God or Most High felt more appropriate in that context.
Okay, Daniel only 8 times. What about Job?
Job is another interesting case. While the prose sections of the book, the prologue and epilogue, contain the name Yahweh 31 times, and it appears once in a proverb quoted in chapter 12, verse 9, it is remarkably not found anywhere else in the extensive poetic dialogues that make up the bulk of the book. So a total of 32 occurrences, but almost entirely absent from the poetry. This choice by the poetic author could signal a focus on God's transcendent wisdom and power, using terms like Elohim or Shaddai instead, perhaps to emphasize the mystery surrounding God's ways that Job and his friends are grappling with.
So the choice of name reflects the book's themes.
It seems to, yes. And finally, the author of Chronicles writing later, after the exile, when not directly quoting earlier sources like Samuel or Kings, shows a noticeable preference for using Elohim, or Ha-Elohim, the God, rather than Yahweh. Now, Yahweh isn't entirely absent from Chronicles. It appears 175 times in First Chronicles and 384 times in 2 Chronicles. But the preference for Elohim is clear. This might signal a broader move away from the explicit use of Yahweh in certain post-exilic contexts, perhaps reflecting that intensifying reverence for the name that would eventually lead to it becoming unutterable in common speech. So these strategic omissions or rare uses really highlight deliberate choices by the biblical authors, revealing something about the nature or context of their respective books.
That's a really clear pattern of usage, both in its incredible prevalence and its deliberate absence in specific places. On the flip side, where is Yahweh found with the highest frequency? Which books use it the most?
Right, so conversely, Yahweh is used with significantly high frequency in many other books, particularly those that focus directly on God's covenantal relationship with Israel, his laws, his direct speech through the prophets, and his actions in history. It is very frequent in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the major prophetic books. That makes sense because the prophets are constantly delivering messages directly from God, often starting with, "Thus says Yahweh." It's also very common in the Book of Songs, which is essentially Israel's prayer and songbook full of direct address, praise, and lament to God, and it's very frequent in the historical books like Genesis, Exodus, Samuel, Kings, which narrate God's active involvement in Israel's story.
Can you give some specific numbers, like which books really stand out?
Sure. If we look at broader sections, the Torah, the first 5 books, has about 1,820 total occurrences of Yahweh. The Prophets section, Nevi'im, has a remarkable 3,523 total occurrences. And the writings, Ketuvim, which includes Psalms, Job, Chronicles, etc., has about 1,485 total. Now, for some individual books with particularly high frequency, Deuteronomy, the book of the covenant renewal on the plains of Moab, uses Yahweh about 550 times. Jeremiah, the prophet wrestling with Judah's judgment and future restoration, uses it a striking 726 times. That's huge. Ezekiel, another major prophet dealing with exile and hope, uses it 434 times. And Psalms, as we mentioned, the heart of Israel's worship, uses Yahweh 695 times. This distribution really highlights its central place in the core legal, prophetic, and poetic traditions, underscoring God's personal covenantal engagement with his people.
Yeah, those numbers really drive home how central the name Yahweh was.
And don't forget the shortened form, Yah. We mentioned it appears 50 times. It shows up in early poems like Exodus 15.2, but it's also frequently used in later psalms, especially in that key phrase, Yah, hallelujah, praise Yah, where it appears 24 times just in that form. This shorter form kind of illustrates the name's ongoing presence and vitality, even as maybe the full form became less explicitly pronounced in some circles over time.
Right, okay, so it's incredibly frequent, central to Israel's faith, yet over time it became unutterable. We touched on why, the reverence aspect. But how exactly did this practice of non-pronunciation develop, and what did it mean for how the name was used or substituted in later Jewish tradition, and maybe even carrying into the New Testament period?
Yeah, the trajectory of the name's usage is a really compelling story of theological development and scribal practice. It marks a significant shift in how Israel related to God's revealed name. As we discussed, centuries before the time of Christ, certainly by the Second Temple period, the later Hebrews came to regard the Tetragrammaton as just too holy to be pronounced in everyday life, maybe even in liturgical reading outside of very specific contexts like the temple. This profound reverence, likely rooted in Exodus 20.7 and Leviticus 24.1, led to this tradition of it being a nomen ineffabile, an unutterable name. And this deep respect wasn't just about not saying it, it led to actively using substitutes. We mentioned referring to God simply as the name, Hashem, or the Samaritans using Shema. It was a profound act of veneration in itself.
So the Masoretes, inserting the vowels of Adonai, or Elohim, was a way to codify this practice in the written text.
Exactly. That practice, the Quaere Perpetuum, became the standard way to ensure reverence for the unutterable name when encountering it in the written scrolls. The Masoretes, these incredibly diligent scribes preserving the Hebrew Bible, deliberately placed the vowels of Adonai, Lord, or Elohim, God, under the 4 consonants YHWH. It was an instruction manual embedded in the text. Don't say this name, say Lord or God instead. It wasn't a mistake, not a typo. It was a carefully calculated system to guide the oral reading and maintain the sanctity of the name. And again, the fact that the Septuagint translators way back in the 3rd century BCE consistently rendered as Ho Kyrios, the Lord, shows just how widespread and established this reverential substitution was across the Jewish world, long before the Masoretes formalized the vowel pointing.
So this practice of reverence meant the name was increasingly substituted in reading and likely in speech. Did this mean the name Yahweh just kind of faded away from common use altogether over time?
In general, yes, that seems to be the trend, particularly in the post-exilic period and then moving into early Judaism. The explicit use of the name Yahweh gradually fell into disuse in many contexts. It was increasingly supplanted by Elohim and especially by Adonai in readings and likely in prayer and common speech. This trend continued and intensified so that by the time of early Judaism, the name had receded significantly, maybe even completely disappeared from common verbal usage outside very restricted settings. It was consistently replaced by Adonai, Lord, in Hebrew contexts, or Kyrios, Lord, in Greek-speaking Jewish contexts.
Was there a theological reason for this shift beyond just reverence?
Well, it might also be related to an evolving understanding or expression of monotheistic faith. As Israel's unique monotheistic faith developed and became more firmly established, perhaps the original function of the name Yahweh, which was partly to distinguish Israel's God very clearly from all the other polytheistic deities in the ancient Near East, maybe that function became slightly less crucial in some ways. Now, the personal aspect of God's interaction with his people remained absolutely central to their faith. But perhaps it came to be expressed more through these other linguistic means, Adonai, Lord, Father in Judaism, and then carried into early Christianity, rather than through the direct pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton. The reverence for God's unique identity remained, but its vocal expression shifted.
And we saw earlier that even within the Old Testament itself, different writers or traditions use the name differently.
Exactly. Those variations reflect these evolving perspectives and Scrabble practices, even within the biblical era itself. Just to recap, the Yahwist J source uses right from Genesis 2, seemingly assuming it was always known. The Elohist G source holds off until the revelation at Horeb in Exodus 3, using Elohim before that. The priestly P source waits until Exodus 6 for the revelation, explicitly stating the patriarchs knew God as El Shaddai, and then uses Yahweh freely after that point. The Deuteronomic D source uses Rapa frequently, emphasizing that covenant name. And then the chronicler, writing later, shows that preference for Elohim when not directly quoting older material. These variations really highlight a dynamic relationship with the divine name across different periods and authors within the canon itself.
Okay. So we see the full name, Yahweh, the substitutions like Adonai and Lord, and its changing frequency over time. But you also mentioned the fascinating world of names and phrases that are derived from Yahweh. Even if the full name became unutterable, what can these derived forms tell us about the pervasive presence of God's name in ancient Israelite life and thought?
Right. This is where the name really shows its deep roots in the culture, even when the full form wasn't spoken commonly. It forms elements within personal names and creates these powerful descriptive phrases. Let's look at the shortened forms first. We mentioned Rhea. It's clearly a contraction of Rhea, and it appears 50 times. It shows up in those early, powerful poems like Exodus 15.2, My Strength and Song is Yah, and Exodus 17.16, Hand to the Throne of Yah, also Isaiah 38.1n, but it's also really frequent in the later Psalms, especially the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113, 118 typically. And of course, it's the key part of Hallelujah, Praise Yah. This shows its enduring liturgical and poetic significance. It was a way to keep the essence of God's personal name vibrant in their worship, even if the full four-letter name was set apart.
Hallelujah. Yeah, we say it all the time without maybe realizing its direct connection back to Yahweh.
Exactly. And then you have those other forms used in names, Yahu and Yahu. These show up in those theophoric names, names incorporating a divine element. These aren't just, linguistic bits. They show how deeply woven God's name was into personal identity. When Yahweh is the final element in a name, it can change slightly to Yah or Yahu, like in Netanyahu, which reduces to Netanyah. When it's the prefix, Yo or Yahu, are common. Remember, Yahu is thought to be the oldest and also the latest form, with Koyo being kind of an intermediate form used more in the post-exilic period up until Chronicles. These little variations illustrate how common and adaptable the name was within the structure of personal identity. People were literally carrying God's name around with them.
And we see these forms outside the Bible too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Those extra-biblical shortened forms confirm this. The form is the normal way the name appears in those 5th century elephantine papyri from the Jewish community in Egypt. And you even find isolated instances of some Egyptian Aramaic texts. These provide external verification that these shortened forms were in real-world use.
It's incredible to think how many biblical figures literally carried part of God's name within their own. Can you give some of the most common examples of these theophoric names again?
Sure, it really tells you a lot about a culture's worldview when divine names become part of everyday personal identity. The name is a super common component in Old Testament personal names, especially during the monarchy period. It appears as Yo or Yo at the beginning and Yohu or Yah at the end. These names weren't just labels, they often express the parent's faith, their gratitude, or the circumstances of the child's birth. So you get familiar names like Yahweh, Jonathan, which can also be Yasha, Jonathan, meaning Yahweh has given, this maybe expressing gratitude for the gift of a child. Yahweh has bestowed. Yahweh has been gracious, like the name John. Yahweh knows. Yahweh establishes or will establish. Yahweh raises up. Jehoshua, which we know better as Joshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation, hugely significant name. And Yahweh has judged. These names reflect hope, gratitude, acknowledging God's sovereign hand, his active role in people's lives and in Israel's history. It's a deeply theological understanding embedded in personal identity.
Wow. Joshua Yahweh is salvation. That adds another layer to his role in leading Israel into the Promised Land. So beyond individual names, were there common phrases or titles that combined Yahweh with other descriptions?
Yes, definitely. Yahweh is also used with several predicates, descriptive words or phrases to form sacred names for specific holy places, or more often, to describe God's attributes and character, highlighting his active presence in specific situations. For instance, you have Yahweh Elohim. This combination, Yahweh God, is a customary way to refer to God, and it's especially prominent back in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. It seems to emphasize God as both the personal, covenant-making God, Yahweh, and the sovereign creator God, Elohim.
Yahweh Elohim.
Then a very famous one, Yahweh Sabaoth. This is usually translated Yahweh of hosts, or sometimes Lord of hosts. The hosts likely refers to the heavenly armies, the angelic beings, maybe even the stars. It speaks to God's immense power and sovereign dominion over all creation, visible and invisible. It's a title emphasizing his majesty and might.
Yahweh of hosts, often used by the prophets, I think.
Very much so. Then you have these really descriptive combinations that arise from specific events in the narrative. Yahweh Yireh. This means Yahweh will provide, or Yahweh sees. It's the name Abraham gives to the place where God provided the ram instead of Isaac in Genesis 22.4. It commemorates God's faithful provision in a moment of extreme testing. Then, Yahweh Nisi, meaning Yahweh is my banner. This comes from Exodus 17.15. Moses gives this name to an altar built after a victory over the Amalekites, proclaiming God as their source of victory, their rallying point, the standard under which they fight and triumph.
Yahweh Yireh, Yahweh Nisi. Names tied to specific acts of God.
Exactly. They're like memorial stones in language. Then there's Yahweh said Kanu, meaning Yahweh is our righteousness. This powerful name is found in Jeremiah in chapters 23 and 33. It's applied prophetically to the future messianic king, signifying that true righteousness doesn't come from human effort, but from God himself, embodied in his chosen king. There is also Shiro, Yahweh Shalom, meaning Yahweh is peace. This comes from Judges 6.24. It's the name Gideon gave to an altar he built after encountering the angel of Yahweh and being reassured, signifying God as the ultimate source of peace and well-being. And finally, Yahweh Shema, meaning Yahweh is there. This is from the very end of Ezekiel chapter 48, verse 35. It's the name given to the beautifully reconstructed Jerusalem in Ezekiel's final vision, highlighting the ultimate blessing, God's abiding, manifest presence with his people in the restored city.
Yahweh Shema. Yahweh is there. That's a powerful concluding image in Ezekiel.
It really is. These aren't just abstract titles. They are concise, powerful statements rooted in Israel's experience, declaring God's activity, his provision, his protection, his righteousness, his peace, and his constant presence among his people. And one more phrase worth noting is the emphatic self-declaration. Anoki Yahweh, meaning I am Yahweh. This appears alone or introducing clauses very prominently in the Ten Commandments, like Exodus 20, verses 2 and 5. It's this direct, authoritative declaration of God's unique identity and his sovereign claim upon his people, emphasizing his personal involvement in the covenant.
I am Yahweh. the foundation of the covenant relationship. Okay, this is incredibly rich. We've seen how the name operates with the biblical text and the language and names and phrases. But does its existence extend beyond the Bible's pages? What external non-biblical evidence do we actually have for the name Yahweh?
Right, the physical evidence. This is where archaeology provides some really concrete corroboration for the ancient usage of the name. Perhaps one of the most stunning and important finds is the Mesha inscription, which is also known as the Moabite stone. It was discovered back in 1868. This is a large basalt monument dating all the way back to the 9th century BCE. That's the time of kings like Ahab in Israel. And crucially, this isn't an Israelite text. It was set up by Mesha, the king of Moab, to commemorate his victory over Israel.
So, written by an enemy king.
Exactly. And right there, inscribed by an enemy of Israel, we find an explicit mention of Yahweh. The inscription boasts about Mesha's accomplishments against Israel and includes lines like, "And I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, dragging them before Chemosh," Chemosh being the chief god of Moab. This isn't just a footnote. It's independent, undeniable proof from a non-Israelite source that the divine name Yahweh was known and referenced by neighboring peoples in the 9th century BCE. It powerfully validates its historical reality outside the Bible itself.
Wow. To find it in an enemy's inscription, that's strong evidence. What else is there?
From a slightly later period, around the late 7th century BCE, just before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BCE, we have the Lachish letters. These are ostraka, basically, pieces of broken pottery used like ancient notepads found in the ruins of a military outpost called Lachish. These letters contain everyday correspondence, military reports, and they include the name Yahweh in greetings, blessings, and assertions. For example, wishing someone well by Yahweh. It shows the name was part of everyday communication, even in a military context, right up to the eve of the exile.
So not just on official monuments, but in everyday writing, too.
Precisely. And similarly, the Tel Arad ostraka, also from the late 7th century BCE, founded at another Judahite fortress, also contained the name Yahweh, often in greetings or blessings like, "May Yahweh bless you." This further supports its common use in that period. Then if we move forward a bit into the 5th century BCE, during the Persian period, we have the Egyptian Aramaic papyri, especially the cache found at Elephantine Island in Egypt. These documents come from a Jewish military colony stationed there, and they frequently use the shortened form "you" for Yahweh in their letters, contracts, and religious documents. This shows that the name, even in its shortened form, was used by Jewish communities living far outside the Promised Land.
You in Egypt, confirming those shortened forms we talked about.
Yes, and other related forms like foya are also found occasionally in Egyptian Aramaic texts, and the shortest form appears in some of the Lachish letters as well as the Elephantine texts. So these archaeological finds, taken together the Masha Stele, the Lachish and Ad Ostraka, the Elephantine papyri, they offer concrete, independent evidence of the name's broad circulation and usage in the ancient Near East over several centuries, really solidifying its historical reality.
So we have clear archaeological proof of the name's use. You mentioned earlier, though, that some proposed connections to other ancient deities or names were rejected by scholars. Could you just quickly reiterate why that distinction is important, especially in light of all this solid evidence for Yahweh itself?
Yeah, it's a crucial distinction to maintain. While some older theories did try to link Yahweh to, say, the Ugaritic god Wu, or those old Babylonian names with Yah, or the Mari names with YHWH, these connections are generally not accepted as direct equivalents to the Old Testament Yahweh by modern scholarship. The proposed links are often either linguistically weak, chronologically problematic, or the theological roles of the figures are just too different. The bulk of the evidence points towards a distinct name, uniquely revealed within the context of Israelite history and religion. And while those Greek transcriptions like Iabe and Iaouai do appear later in some Hellenistic, Gnostic texts or magical papyri, these are almost certainly later pagan borrowings from established Jewish theological concepts. They aren't evidence of the name originating outside Israelite revelation. If anything, they show the name's influence spreading outwards. So this distinction is vital for understanding that the name Yahweh in its biblical context really stands apart as the unique personal name revealed by God himself to his covenant people, Israel.
Okay, that distinction is clear. This deep dive into the divine name, or Yahweh, has really been an enlightening conversation. We've traced its likely original pronunciation Yahweh. We've uncovered the history behind the popular, but, well, inaccurate Jehovah. We've delved into its dynamic meaning. He who shows himself to be active, he brings to pass. We've seen its pervasive presence throughout the Old Testament nearly 7,000 times. And we've even found its traces in ancient inscriptions outside the biblical text.
Yeah, it really highlights how absolutely central this particular name was to Israel's understanding of God. It wasn't just a label, it was a statement about his very being, his character, his faithfulness, and his active relationship with his people. And the careful preservation of the name, even to the point where it became unutterable out of reverence, that speaks volumes about the awe and respect it commanded. From a Reformed perspective, this emphasis on God's active, covenantal self-revelation in his name, Yahweh, powerfully underscores that our God is not some static philosophical concept, but a living, working God who reveals himself and acts sovereignly in history according to his perfect wisdom and plan.
So what does this all mean for you listening in? The story of Yahweh really illustrates that even names, especially this name, carry a profound history, a deep meaning, and a significance that can enrich our appreciation for the ancient texts and the God they reveal. That definitely changes how you read so many familiar passages.
Definitely. Maybe consider for yourself, how does understanding the dynamic and active essence of Yahweh, the God who consistently acts, who shows up, who brings his promises to pass, how does that shape your understanding of God's interaction with the world and maybe with your own life? What stands out to you as perhaps the most surprising or relevant insight from this deep dive into his revealed personal name? Something to maybe reflect on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the divine name Yahweh. We trust it has equipped you with some new insights and maybe sparked some further curiosity.